Hi guys, welcome back to Nairobi Legal. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on forced labor and child labor. Remember, this is the third principle of employment, and we started out by discussing discrimination, then we talked about sexual harassment, and now forced labor. So these are the general principles of employment, and when you open the Employment Act of Kenya 2007, you will find the three general principles of employment. So this is our last principle that we are covering as far as employment law in Kenya is concerned, and this is the principle of prohibition against forced labor. With that brief introduction, in addition to the principle of prohibition against forced labor, I've gone ahead to discuss about child labor within the Republic of Kenya. Remember also, this forms part of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. And as you can see from your screen, we set out to understand what amounts to forced labor within the Republic of Kenya based on our Employment Act of Kenya 2007. We're going to also to define what is child labor. Then we are going to also discuss circumstances under which child labor is acceptable according to the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. We will go further to understand what constitutes a worst form of child labor and when can a child qualify to be employed within the Republic of Kenya based on the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. Focusing on the first objective of this video, and specifically Section 4 of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007, when we say forced labor, what we mean is that the person is not offering their work voluntarily, but he or she is doing such work for fear of loss of rights or privileges. And just again to break this down, what I mean is that an employee can find himself in a situation whereby he or she is not offering work voluntarily, but they're just doing it because they fear that there will be loss of rights or privileges that they've been enjoying before. And so, again, just to make this more clear to you, is that when a service is provided because a person is under threat of any penalty, including a threat of loss of rights or privileges, that amounts to forced labor as far as Section 4 of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007 is concerned. Remember, this is unlawful and it can cause a legal suit. You can actually sue for being subjected to forced labor. And as a student of employment law in Kenya, for you to appreciate the meaning of the principle of prohibition against forced labor within the Republic of Kenya, please consider reading the case of Daniel Kiprop, which is available online. You can just go to Kenya Law Resources and find a PDF for this case so that you appreciate the meaning of forced labor within the Republic of Kenya. Still under Section 4 of the Employment Act of Kenya, you need to appreciate as a law student that there are certain exceptions to the definition of forced labor within the context of the Employment Act of Kenya. And what I mean here is that you might have seen prisoners cleaning the city, slashing grass alongside the road, and when they do this kind of work, that does not amount to forced labor, because you must indeed appreciate that as far as Section 4 is concerned, when it comes to community service orders by the court, meaning that people serving a sentence may be actually instructed to do community service, and that will not amount to forced labor within the meaning of Section 4 of the Employment Act of Kenya. The other thing you need to appreciate as a labor law student is that any work or service in cases of emergency, such as in the event of a war, or if you have a disaster or a threat of a calamity in any circumstances that would actually endanger the existence or well-being of whole or part of a population, in that case, if you are called upon to actually help out, that will not amount to forced labor. So again, just to break this down, should we have a war, should we have a disaster that is actually threatening our existence, then you can be called upon to assist in any way possible so that you solve the situation at hand. And when you're called upon to do such kind of work, that will not amount to forced labor within the meaning of Section 4 of the Employment Act of Kenya. Having understood the principle of prohibition against forced labor, now that brings us to the end of the three general principles of employment as far as the Employment Act of Kenya is concerned. And previously I talked about sexual harassment at the workplace and discrimination at the workplace, and now prohibition against forced labor forms the third principle of employment as far as our Employment Act of Kenya is concerned. So just for consistency purposes, you can revisit the other two principles that I discussed previously so that we're on the same page. Now, shifting our focus to child labor, as far as Section 2 of the Employment Act of Kenya is concerned, I want us to first understand who is a child. And now, when you cross-check Section 2 of the Employment Act of Kenya, a child means a person who has not attained the age of 18 years. And if you want to appreciate protection of children as far as employment is concerned, you can consider looking at Section 52 of the Employment Act of Kenya that actually provides for what employment means as far as a child is concerned. And so, as a labor law student also, you need to understand that if a child is doing work as an assistant to someone else, and that work is deemed to be work of another person who is then paid on behalf of that child, then that constitutes employment for a child. As you can see, part B and C still explain what does employment mean for a child. So number one, we've appreciated that a child is a person who has not attained the age of 18, and now we've gone ahead to understand what does employment mean for a child. With that in mind, before I explain circumstances under which employment of a child will be acceptable according to the Employment Act of Kenya, I want you to first appreciate what constitutes a worst form of child labor. Now, this is provided for under Section 53 of the Employment Act of Kenya. And remember that any employer who employs a child under worst forms of child labor will be held liable for that sort of employment given to a child. So up to this point in time, you might be wondering, what does worst form of child labor mean, and what constitutes worst form of child labor? An example would be employing a child to work in an open cast mine. The child is underground removing minerals. That constitutes worst form of child labor, because you know what? By a child working in such circumstances, remember the mine could collapse anytime. That circumstance or that sort of a workplace causes a threat to a child's safety. So anything that actually causes or poses a threat to a child's safety will be deemed as constituting worst form of child labor according to the Employment Act of Kenya 2007, specifically Section 53 of the Employment Act of Kenya. When it comes to employment of children, I want us to appreciate, when can a child qualify to be an employee? And the answer to this question is found under Section 56 of the Employment Act of Kenya, that provides that no person shall employ a child who has not attained the age of 13 years, whether gainfully or otherwise in any undertaking. Now, up to this point in time, you might wonder, does this mean that a child with 13 years and above can be employed within the Republic of Kenya, and will the employer be acting within the law? Now, when we read Section 56 further, children who are between the age of 16, or rather 13 to 16 years, can be employed to perform light work. And as you can see, the next question is that where can a child of 13 to 16 years work? Remember, the first statement provided that no one can employ a child who has not attained the age of 13 years, meaning that there are certain circumstances under which a child who is between the age of 13 to 16 years can actually be employed. Just to take you back to the previous discussion we had, we started out by defining a child according to Section 2 of the Employment Act, and we stated that a child is a person who has not attained the age of 18 years. But now we are starting to realize that there are indeed certain circumstances under which a child between the age of 13 to 16 years will be employed, and it will be legal according to the Employment Act of Kenya 2017. And so when you check Section 52 of the Employment, or rather 56 of the Employment Act of Kenya, subsection 2, a child of between 13 years of age and 16 years may be employed to perform light work. so long as that work is not going to harm that child's health and development, and it's not going to actually stop that child from attending school or participating in vocational orientation or training programs. So these are the conditions attached to employment of children between the age of 13 years to 16 years. So the takeout point from this particular slide is that no employer can employ a child who has not attained the age of 13 years. However, under section 56(2) of the Employment Act of Kenya, a child between 13 years and 16 years of age may be employed to perform light work. Remember, this is also a key word, to perform light work, so long as that kind of work will not harm that child's health or development, or it won't even stop that child from going to school. Having understood that there may be certain circumstances where an employer may employ a child between the age of 13 to 16 years, and that employer will be acting within the law. Now, I want us to appreciate as labor law students, where can't a child aged between 13 to 16 years work? So remember, there are certain conditions attached to this age group, and according to section 58 of the Employment Act of Kenya, a child who is aged between 13 to 16 years of age is not allowed to undertake any work that involves that child to attend to machinery, meaning that you can't employ such a child to operate for you your machine in a factory. That is contrary to the Employment Act of Kenya, and this is in line with section 58 of the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. However, remember that if that child is working under contract of apprenticeship or indentured learnership, and what we mean here is that that child will be working in that organization for purposes of mastering an art, and that is a contract of apprenticeship, or that child is working under someone to simply train them to gain certain skills, so that actually they get out as better people, and basically for educational purposes, then in that case, that is within the law as far as section 58 of the Employment Act of Kenya is concerned. Now remember that we're going to be discussing about contracts of apprenticeship and indentured learnership, so that you understand what do these big words mean, But the takeout point is that you can't employ a child between the age of 13 to 16 years to attend to your machines in a factory or manufacturing, and they're the ones operating these machines. That is contrary to section 58 of the Employment Act. But as you can see, other than one serving under contract of apprenticeship, if that child is there for purposes of learning how that machine works, then that will be fine as far as section 58 of the Employment Act of Kenya is concerned. As we come to the end of this video, I want you to appreciate that this is just an exam strategy. These are some of the questions you need to ask yourself as you answer a question on child labor within the Republic of Kenya, and according to the provisions of the Employment Act of Kenya. And also you need to appreciate as a labor law student that employment law is very, very specific, and you need to justify your answers by using specific provisions of the Employment Act of Kenya. Up to this point in time, I also want to let you know that in our next video, we're going to project an employment contract and review it, so that you're able to understand the rights and duties of employees, so that you're able to understand also what provisions could be put in an employment contract, and those provisions are still unlawful and unacceptable according to the Employment Act of Kenya 2007. Basically, we are going to review an employment contract, so that the next time a person hands over an employment contract to you, you're able to understand what document you're signing, and what provisions you're looking out for, and what questions you're able to ask faced with any scenario. So that's our next video. And this also takes you back to watching the first two videos I made on employment law in Kenya, so that we are consistent and we have the same flow of thoughts. So obviously this is still an addition to the exam strategy on the questions you can ask yourself as far as child labor is concerned. And this brings us to the end of this video. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Thank you.